Greek freedom didn't mean what you think. For many Greeks, freedom meant a polis ruling itself, even while Athens denied political voice to most people living inside it. A free city could still exclude most residents. This is the story of the Greek polis and different models of freedom, and of how one word, eleutheria, could describe self-rule at the level of the city more than liberty at the level of the individual. This is history. Like a lot of people, I grew up hearing that the Greeks invented freedom and that Athens was the place where democracy finally arrived. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. Athens did create a remarkable system of mass participation for citizens. But the missing detail is this. Greek freedom was usually not about the liberty of every individual. It was about whether a polis ruled itself. So what exactly was a polis, and who counted inside this so-called free city? The modern misconception has two parts. First, we imagine Greek freedom as basically the same thing as our own language of personal rights. Second, we imagine Athenian democracy as political inclusion for everyone living there. That belief survives because Athens gives us images that feel familiar. Citizens debated in public. Offices could be distributed broadly, often by lot rather than inherited rank. Large juries heard cases in a way that made politics feel visible and shared. Even ordinary citizens could expect to serve, judge, vote, and speak in ways that still feel startlingly participatory. Payment for some public service in the later 5th and 4th centuries BCE also widened access, because poorer citizens could afford to spend time in civic life. Policy could be argued before a mass body instead of a king. If you stop there, Athens looks like the birthplace of modern democracy. I believed that too, until I started asking what Greek words meant in Greek political life, not in ours. And that is where the first crack appears. In ancient Greek, the same political world that celebrated freedom also assumed hierarchy inside the household, the workshop, and the city. A man could be politically equal to fellow citizens at the Pnyx, while still standing atop a household shaped by dependence and unequal status. So the word sounds familiar, but the structure behind it is not. In ancient Greek, polis meant more than a physical city. It was a socio-political community with laws, institutions, territory, and a claim on the loyalty of its citizens. That phrase matters, because if a polis is only a place, freedom sounds like a map problem. But if a polis is a community with institutions, freedom becomes a power problem. Who makes the laws? Who commands the army? Who collects revenue? Who honors the city's gods and festivals? Who controls the courts that settle disputes and punish offenses? And who gets to say that this community answers to no master above it? That matters because freedom, in this world, was usually collective before it was personal. A polis was free when it was not ruled by a foreign king or another city. So when Greeks spoke about eleutheria, they often meant political self-rule, not freedom from every hierarchy inside the city. This also explains why the polis could demand so much from citizens. Military service, jury service, assembly attendance, taxation, and loyalty were not side issues. They were part of the mechanism that kept the community independent. So the better question is not, was the individual free? It's, was the polis free to govern itself? That question became politically explosive during the main Greek-Persian conflicts of 480 to 479 BCE. When those wars were fought, and Greek discourse later emphasized the defense of free polis against Persian kingship, freedom stopped being just a civic label. It became a battlefield word. Herodotus is crucial here, not because he hands us a modern manifesto, He matters because he preserves the language Greeks used to describe the conflict. In his world, the contrast is often between a great king and self-governing communities. That does not mean Persia was simply a cartoon of tyranny. It means Greek authors framed the struggle in political terms they cared about most. Herodotus even puts striking language into Greek mouths, including the claim that Athenians, once freed from tyrants, fought better because each man was working for himself rather than for a master. Whether every speech in Herodotus is verbatim is another question. But the pattern still matters because it shows how Greeks remembered and argued about power. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and smaller polis did not share one constitution. Some were oligarchic, some were democratic, some moved in and out of tyranny or elite rule over time. Sparta, for example, had kings, elders, magistrates, and a citizen assembly, which looked nothing like Athens and still counted as a free polis in Greek eyes. But they could still describe themselves as free if they were not under Persian kingship. This is why the language of freedom could unite cities that disagreed on almost everything else. And it tells us something important about political identity. Freedom here is not first a private possession. It is the public status of the community. So now the picture sharpens. Freedom was a political status of the polis, not a guarantee that everyone inside it shared political power. Nowhere is that contradiction clearer than Athens itself. In the 5th century BCE, Athens developed a mass citizen democracy with an assembly open to adult male citizens. That is a remarkable sentence, and every word matters. Mass means politics was not limited to a tiny hereditary court. Citizen means participation depended on legal membership, not mere residence. Democracy means the assembly could hear proposals, vote, and shape policy directly. It could decide on war, alliances, finance, decrees, and the election of certain magistrates, making the citizen body a real governing force rather than a symbolic audience. And adult male citizens means the category was broad for its time, but still narrow by ours. When I looked closer, the numbers changed the mood. In the 4th century BCE, the adult male citizen body in Attica may have been around 30,000 to 40,000. The total population was probably in the low hundreds of thousands, with estimates often ranging roughly from 200,000 to 300,000. That means most people under Athenian power were not part of the assembly at all. Even if we allow for uncertainty in ancient population estimates, the ratio is still the point. The politically active body was large by ancient standards, yet still only a fraction of the human beings living in Attica. Women were excluded from the political rights of citizenship and from assembly participation. Resident foreigners, called metics, could work, trade, pay taxes, and serve in war, yet still remain outside the citizen body. Some metics became wealthy bankers, merchants, or craftsmen. But wealth did not automatically open the assembly. Many of the people who made Athenian commerce possible were therefore essential to the city and still politically voiceless. Enslaved people formed part of the labor system that made Athenian life function, and they had no political standing in the democracy that later became famous. That included domestic work, workshop labor, and in some cases, brutal mining labor far from the ideals spoken on the Pnyx. Even the famous democratic machinery tells that story. An ostrakon, or a jury token, was not a symbol of universal liberty. It was proof that some people belonged to the decision-making body and others did not. Citizenship itself could also tighten over time. By the mid-5th century BCE, Pericles' citizenship law famously restricted citizenship more sharply by requiring citizen parentage on both sides. So the boundary was not an accident. It was something the democracy actively defined and defended. So the impossible fact at the center of this story is actually true. A city could call itself free because it ruled itself, even though most of the people living there had no vote at all. That is not a trick of wording. It is a clue that freedom was operating at a different level. And there was another layer I couldn't ignore. Political language alone did not keep Athens free. Institutions need revenue. Warships need timber, bronze, rowers, maintenance, and pay. Around 483 BCE, a major silver vein was discovered at Laurion, later helping finance the Athenian fleet. Ancient sources connect that moment to Themistocles, who pushed Athens to use the proceeds for ships rather than simply distribute the money to citizens. That choice matters because it turns raw geology into state capacity. That windfall mattered because Athens could turn metal in the ground into hulls in the water. And hulls in the water mattered because the Persian Wars were fought soon after, with naval power proving decisive at Salamis. A trireme was not just a ship, it was a floating system that required huge coordination, hundreds of rowers, trained crews, dockyards, and a state able to mobilize all of it quickly. So the mines at Laurion were tied not only to wealth, but to the physical machinery of autonomy. So freedom was not only argued by Herodotus or voted on at the Pnyx, it was also dug out of the ground. And that introduces a darker edge to Athenian freedom. Some of the wealth that sustained democratic power came through labor performed by people with no share in that political freedom. The assembly on the Pnyx could debate, but silver from beneath Attic soil helped put Athenian power afloat. And that pushes us to a deeper insight. Greek freedom was argued in language, defended in war, and sustained by institutions and wealth, not by words alone. So what actually was Greek freedom? It was not primarily modern individual liberty. It was the self-rule of a polis. And that is why Athens can make sense at last. Athens was democratic for citizens, but not for everyone who lived there. Herodotus makes more sense. The Pnyx makes more sense. And the Laurion silver makes more sense. Because autonomy needed ships, and ships needed money. What I find most revealing is that this old Greek distinction still shadows modern politics. We still use freedom at more than one level. Sometimes we mean personal rights. Sometimes we mean the independence of a state. The Greeks remind us that those are not the same thing. A community can be externally free and internally unequal. That is the elevating idea here. Once you see the difference between collective self-rule and personal liberty, you start spotting it far beyond ancient Greece. This Greek polis reminds us that political words only become real when we ask who belongs, who decides, and who pays for the system. But once Greek freedom was tied to the autonomy of the polis, the next struggle was unavoidable. What happened when one free city began building an empire over other Greek cities? This polis reminds us that freedom can describe a community's independence even while masking inequality inside its walls. At no history, we stay with the words people used, the institutions they built, and the evidence that shows what those terms actually meant in their own world. Which mattered more in this episode's evidence? The assembly on the Pnyx, Herodotus's language of free polis, or the Laurion silver that helped put Athenian power afloat? Until the next city claims the name of freedom, stay with the record.